Welcome everybody. I'm pleased to be here and to talk about the secure software development lifecycle for lab automation. My name is Marc Porr. I am a SiLA director and I am head of the SiLA cybersecurity working group, and I am the CEO and founder of the company TechkIT. And today we will be talking about why you should bother about software in your lab, what a software development lifecycle is, and where you can start if I convinced you that this is a concern you might want to have. So first, what is software? We could think of software as in silico process definitions or automation. We put a process into something that we can repeat and that defines how this process is carried out. So from this perspective, software is more a process and should be handled as such as you do in your QM. A short disclaimer, we will be talking about in-house software today. I will shortly say what I mean by in-house software, but this doesn't mean that your supplier software is generally safe. You should ask for the same processes from your suppliers, but this is not the scope of this talk. So our software as an in silico process definition goes from everywhere, like an Excel spreadsheet, up to enterprise systems you might be developing. So if you have an Excel spreadsheet that does calculations and that is part of any of your measurements processes or whatsoever, that is software, because you have rules in there and you should make sure that these are reliable, that they are safe, and that you can trust the data that is generated by your Excel spreadsheet. And on the spectrum from Excel spreadsheets to enterprise systems, there is a lot of stuff that we usually see in lab automation, like VBA macros in your Excel spreadsheets, Python scripts, or any other sort of scripts that you produce to analyze data or that you use to work on your data. There is middleware, which is any kind of software that translates from one API to another. SiLA driver, for example, is usually this kind of software. So you translate from an API that is provided by a device to SiLA. You have automations in place that run on your kit. You have connectors for external systems where you ingress data from your LIMS, or you transform data from your ERP, or send back results to your LIMS automatically. And you have converters to connect different pieces of systems you have in your organization. So on this spectrum, you are having software, and usually these kinds of softwares are the ones that you are producing yourselves. So somebody is having a machine that is running a VBA macro or a Python script, and this is probably something you want to keep safe, and this is something where you do not want somebody to mingle with your data without you noticing. This could be malicious actors, obviously. It could also be human error, people making changes you cannot see, and you're producing data that is not correct, that is not... I mean, the problem is with data where you cannot see it's incorrect. Obviously, if something fails, you at least see it fails. But if some data is generated in a way that it's not trustworthy and you can't notice, this obviously is a great impact on the quality of the results you are producing with these pieces of software in between. Why should you bother about this? Well, cyber risks are increasing rapidly. We are seeing a lot more of cybercrime, especially which is happening in the LLM world. We also see geopolitical strains that increase cyber attacks. We see this becoming a real business model, companies doing hacking for a living, people buying vulnerabilities, and obviously in our space of lab automation there is a real physical danger tied to it. So it could be patient safety, which is more transient danger. If we have manipulations in the data, poisoned data that we cannot detect, then maybe the outcome of a study will be changed. We will get to results that were not backed by the science. We will maybe even have drugs in the market that are not safe. And also there's the very direct impact. If you have automation kit, there may be workplace safety also at risk when somebody gets into these systems. And on another level, a more corporate risk level, obviously your intellectual property is at risk when somebody is systems and can steal or manipulate and poison the data you're having in your systems. So maybe, and that's the worst thing, I think, you are creating results. Somebody changed one little piece in this chain of data transformations, and they are getting the correct data and you are getting poisoned data, and you are working on that poisoned data, and really somebody else is getting the real results. And this is, I think, the worst case for everybody who is doing science for a living and for every company relying on it. And that this is a real problem is becoming increasingly visible. This is an editorial from Nature where they analyzed that now nearly 25% of all hacks are somehow related to healthcare. And it's a great read, and it's really interesting to see that this is becoming, also with the geopolitical things we're seeing at the moment, is becoming a target for cyber criminals, is becoming a target for hackers. And obviously this is only what we know. If there are cases of data manipulation, data poisoning that are not obvious, it's very, very hard to detect. So you should care if you're in any position generating data or relying on data in a company that you create by any means of software with the software definition we had before. So what can we do? Well, the good news is there are a lot of things we can learn from software development, because this is nothing new. In the lab, we are sometimes a little bit in our own bubble, but if we take a look outside of that bubble, there is something called a software development lifecycle, or a secure software development lifecycle, when you add all the security requirements to it. And it's something that is used in the IT industry for creating software for many, many years now. So what is the software development lifecycle? When we think about the creation process of software, obviously, we will start with some kind of idea. This is something I want to automate. This is some data analysis I want to perform. And then we look at the idea and we analyze, okay, how can we put this process into software? As we said, software is an in silico process definition. So we need to analyze the process, get all the steps right, and then we can put that into software. If we have the process, we need a design. So we need some kind of software system sketched out. How can we meet the requirements that we now know from the analysis phase? This is also what you call software design or systems design, systems architecture. And this architectural part, that's very important to get right, because with a lot of vulnerabilities and a lot of threats you can deal at this stage. A good design is way more resilient than we will just do it kind of design. And this is also where the expertise from systems architects and software architects is very important. And when we are staying in our own bubble in the lab, usually this expertise isn't really there. People learned how to write Python scripts, but people never learned about software architecture and, even more important, systems architecture. So get the right people on board, talk to people who do that for a living. Also, I was doing that and I'm still doing that for a living for a long time, so I can tell you it's a little bit a different kind of skill set to looking at a problem in a system like this than it is just from the process perspective that we need here. This is a very domain-driven perspective where you need the people actually knowing what needs to be done, why can this be done. And this is a lot more about the how do we need to set up a system to get this done. Then you have the implementation phase, obviously, where you actually write some code, build systems, or have something, might it even be a VBA macro, something that really does the thing. And then you do tests and approval. You might be doing them implicitly, but still when you are in the implementation phase, you will continuously test with test data and see, okay, this is working. And at some point you will say, okay, I met all the requirements that we had in the analysis phase, and now we can say, okay, this piece of software we think will be performing somehow like we defined it. So we will make a release. Releasing software means we put it somewhere where it actually runs productively. And then from this productive stage, there is the operational phase where we use it and where we gather a lot of data. We might want some monitoring attached to it, so we actually see when something goes wrong. We can also monitor for security incidents, obviously, which is very important, but we can also monitor for incidents like bugs, something crashing, or data being generated that is not correct. And it's called a life cycle because usually this is a cycle. When you're running your software, you will find bugs, you will find vulnerabilities, and you will find places where your requirements were not as good as you thought. So you will always get back to this analysis phase where you rethink the requirements or add new requirements and then go through this again at some point, have a new release, a version 2 of the same software that gets operational, and so on and so forth. So this is more about how do we build software. How does this become a secure software development lifecycle? Well, by adding some things to these steps. So in the analysis phase, you should also think about threats. What are the ways somebody could maliciously interact with my software? So it's not only the good path requirements, not only the happy path, everything goes right, but what happens if somebody inserts data that has flaws in it? If somebody poisons data with some kind of pattern, do we think about this? Do we think about people getting into the system, maliciously interacting with the system? So in the design phase, we need to think about these requirements as well. All the requirements that are about resilience, about the software being robust against poisoning, being robust against changes, also being robust against human errors, because this is what's happening a lot more often than the malicious intent. Somebody just disabling a calibration because he needed it at some point, forgetting to re-enable it, changing a method. The method is not stored in some kind of version audit trail way, so the changes are not detected. We need to think about these things in the design phase as well. In the implementation phase, there are two things we need to do. We need to analyze risks that come from the decisions we make. If we choose some pattern on how to write an algorithm, we have to think about, is there risk attached to it? Can somebody use that to trick the software? If we use a certain kind of third-party library, we need to think about vulnerabilities in that library. So we need to know, okay, there is something else in my software that we need to care about. Also, code reviews are a great tool in the implementation phase when a second pair of eyes, or maybe today an AI looks at your code and tells you, okay, maybe there is something, I would think about that could also be used in a malicious way, or this is not robust if the data is not correct. If you're getting, data you're not expecting, this will crash, this will not work. This is something that is caught by code reviews. In the test and approval phase, we need to test also for security vulnerabilities or for security measures. Do not only think about the requirements you have for the tool to generate the output that you want, but also think about security tests, like what happens if I add an SQL query in that input field. That's a very common thing. People trying to interact with the database directly via UI. So think about that and test that. And when you release the version of your software, also make sure the configuration is secure. So when you release it to a system where it's running productive, make sure you are blocking ports that are not needed. Make sure you are having version control. Make sure you are having a firewall. Make sure you are catching DDoS attacks, so people probing your server a lot of times to just get it unresponsive. Make sure you have software and measures and configuration in place to catch that. Also, you need a default specification for your operations. So what is the way I want this to work, because that is what you will be monitoring in operation later on. If you do not know how your software operates when it's operating correctly, you are not able to detect any, well, deviations from that operation. So if you do not know what's the normal CPU you load, or the normal systems that your software is connecting to and talking to, you cannot detect if somebody is inside your system and tries to make connections to other systems that are not on your list. So there are two things here. The first one is you would want to close that doors, close that connections at all, and you also want to have a baseline that you can monitor for. And another thing when you do a release is, when you release your software, you're having a defined version with all the dependencies, all the third-party software products inside. So make sure you have a software bill of materials where you know all the versions of all the pieces of third-party software you have in there, because this is a way of getting vulnerabilities into your software. Vulnerabilities are detected in all kinds of softwares all the time. We will get to that in a second. So you would want to know, the same as you would want to have a bill of materials for your hardware automation, you would want to have a bill of materials for the software components in your automation. And now, as we are operating that piece of software, we want to have system hardening. We want to make sure that only legitimate calls to that software are processed. We want to make sure that nobody can access confidential data without being logged in or without being in your network. All these kinds of things. And we need to monitor our operations. And this is where the SBOM comes in again. We want to do software composition analysis on a concurrent basis. So if there is a new vulnerability detected in the version of your software or in the version of a third-party library in your software, you need an alert. You would want to know, okay, there is a security vulnerability. I need to patch that. I need to release a new version of my software with the new version of that third-party dependency. This can be done automatically, but you need to monitor for that. And to do that, you need the SBOM. And you want to do incident detection. So you want to check what is currently happening against the baseline that we created here. We have the default operation specifications, and we want to detect if some deviations in the behavior of your systems to the specifications are there. And then we want automated alerting. I put some flashes here on the 4 things that I think are the biggest ones you should think about when running in-house built software in production. In production meaning working with your actual data, working with your actual kit. So make sure you get your risk analysis right. Make sure you do security tests while you can. When you have an implementation, test that. Do not only test it when it's too late. Make sure you get your systems hardened. Make sure you even have productive systems. An office laptop running a productive Python script on data, that's not a secured runtime environment. Make sure you have a dedicated system that is made for that, that's running this piece of software that you need in production, so you can really have that baseline. You have a system that is way more static than an office computer, so doing SBOM for an office computer is a lot harder than doing the specification for some system that is running dedicatedly for that purpose. Make sure you harden that system, and also make sure you monitor that system to detect if something goes wrong. On average, an attacker is in a system for about 3 months before being recognized. So that's a lot of time for doing many things, for placing backdoors, for lying traps you will stumble up later on, for even creating second and third paths of entry so they can still get in when you close the first door. Make sure you monitor your systems to detect them as soon as possible. And now the question is, okay, I hope I convinced you that you should think about that. Where can you start on a practical basis? And a very practical way of thinking about this is the software security testing pyramid. So on the low level of the pyramid, you have automated checks, We do static code analysis that can be done by automated systems that check for patterns in your code that are security risks. We do dependency scans. That's what I was talking about before, the software composition analysis. Check all the components in your software for known vulnerabilities and do that on a daily or at least weekly basis, so you make sure to catch new vulnerabilities that are disclosed. And this can be automated. If you have a DevOps platform, like for example GitLab, you can have continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines. And in these pipelines, you can automate all of this. So nobody has to do this by hand. This can be done fully automated, and this all runs on the source code. So you do not need to have a running version of your program. You only need the source code for doing that. The next level is interactive tests with your real software. So now you're having a version of the software, it's getting deployed, and now you can also do tests against that running version. You can do dynamic application security testing. This can be done automatically, also to a certain extent, where a software probes your system for vulnerabilities, tries to get in, does fuzzing on inputs. It obviously needs a real running version of that, so you do not want to do that on your productive system. So you make sure you have a certain staging environment where you have a test system that this can run against, but this can also be automated to a large extent. So it's easy to do, it's not costing a lot of money if you have it. And the last thing, which is expensive because it's human-led QA, you would want to make sure to only do that on top of these two. Because if you do everything by human-led QA, as it's usually done in the lab environment, that's very, very expensive, because obviously you have to do everything by hand. You have to do everything every time. So checking your software every release, checking for vulnerabilities in the third-party dependencies every day, that's an expense nobody wants to carry. There are certain things, though, you need to do manually. That's penetration testing, red teaming, so real white hat hackers trying to get into your system. But that's the Ivy League. That's when everything else is settled, you can do these kind of tests to make sure, okay, everything is fine. So it depends on your risk profile. If you're working with very high risk data in a very high risk environment with that piece of software, you would want to have that on a regular basis. If it's only some kind of convenience data manipulation script, you do not need this maybe. Depends on your risk assessments. So the frequency of these on the bottom are a lot higher. The depth is a lot deeper in here, obviously. If you want to learn about this a little further, I recommend an article in the drug discovery world that Julian Massing from SciS and I wrote. Have a look at that. We explain this in a little more detail there. And if you want to get in touch and want to learn further about what can be done, I recommend visiting our website and also look into the SiLA GitLab repositories, because we implemented templates for software composition analysis, for static analysis and dynamic analysis. It's all open source, as SiLA is open source, so you can use these GitLab CI templates to also integrate these automations in your software. It doesn't need to be a SiLA driver, because it's just generic checking for software. So if you're using a software stack that is similar to where we have a SiLA implementation for, you can simply use these templates, have a look at that, and we will also release a guidelines document about what you need to think about when doing automation. What are the architectural caveats you have to think about? What are the architectural ideas that you should use to have secure automation and to have reliable automation? Also, this is me. If you want to talk any further about any of these topics, I'd love to get in touch. The SiLA Consortium and we as SiLA directors would love to get in touch. So thanks a lot for listening. Have a great day. Bye.